Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am Kristen Boyce, a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice, Pathways to Healing Counseling. Through conversations, education, strategies, and shared stories, we will be closing the chapter on all the thoughts, feelings, people, and circumstances that don't serve you anymore and open the door to possibilities and the real you. You won't want to miss an episode, so be sure to subscribe. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. Today's episode is an episode that every person needs to listen to, especially if you struggle with people pleasing, kind of that fawning response. If you fall into the category of codependency, meaning you feel like in order to feel okay about yourself, your partner, your kids, all have to feel okay. And we break down so much. We look at dysfunctional families, the roles in dysfunctional families. And I hate the word dysfunctional family, but you get the idea where nobody's perfect. So I don't want to paint this picture of a perfect family where we develop ways, defenses, if you will, protective parts in order to gain belonging, love, connection, worthiness in the family system. We talk about codependency. What is it exactly? And then how to set boundaries. It was such a good conversation, and I'm so excited to introduce you to my guest. If this resonates with you, share it on social because I think this could be helpful to so many people. You're probably going to want to listen to this a couple of times because there was such good information and so many pieces that will be important to integrate into your life. So let me introduce you to today's guest. Sharon Martin, DSW, LCSW, is a psychotherapist and author specializing in codependency recovery. For the past 25 years, she's been helping adult children recover from difficult childhoods, overcome feelings of unworthiness, and learn to set boundaries. Dr. Martin is the author of 2 books, the CBT Workbook for Perfectionism and the Better Boundaries Workbook. She also writes the popular blog, Conquering Codependency for Psychology Today, and has been featured in various media outlets, including Psych Central, WebMD, Women's World, and Highly Sensitive Refuge. Those sound very powerful. And I think this is an episode that we're really breaking down the root of codependency. We're looking at how did we develop it? How do we work through it? And it really starts with becoming more self-aware of your patterns, your behavior, and then a willingness to dive into childhood, not to blame, but to create insight. And I definitely think you want to grab the workbook at Kristen, Kristen, Kristen D, I forgot the D, Boyce, BOICE.com/free resources. So you can get the free journal. That would be helpful to take notes, I think, with this episode. And let me know what you think. Did it resonate with you? What were your takeaways? You can share it on social or just send an email. Go to the website. You can send an email or tag me on social at Kristen D. Boyce. So let's dive in to all things codependency, boundaries, dysfunctional families, and let's take a deeper dive. Thanks for listening, and I can't wait to see what aha moments you have. Dr. Sharon Martin, welcome back to the Close the Chapter podcast.
Thanks, Kristen. I am so happy to be here and really excited to talk about cutting ties with your parents.
Oh my gosh. When you were on the podcast, Sharon's been on the podcast before, and she mentioned she was working on this book. I was chomping at the bit, waiting for the workbook to come out. And the minute soon after the workbook come out, I was like to my assistant, I'm like, please reach out to Sharon and let's get her back on the podcast because I'm so excited about this conversation. As we were talking before we hit record, it can be a controversial topic for many people, but people are coming in seeking help specifically around cutting parents off. Should they or shouldn't they?
Yeah.
So what inspired you to write the book? Let's start there.
What you're saying is I have been a therapist for something along the lines of 25 years, so a long time. And who I work with primarily is what we call adult children, which really just means adults who had sort of dysfunctional or difficult childhood experiences. So the family of origin had any number of problems, I would say, right? Sometimes that is substance use or mental health issues, rage, violence, abuse of physical, verbal, any of that. So it can really take a lot of different forms, but we know, of course, that this has a profound impact on children. Any of that has a profound impact on anyone in the family, but especially children who are young and still developing and very vulnerable. This can create a whole set of difficulties for us that don't just disappear when we become adult, right? We carry this with us, the coping skills that we have developed to try to deal with those problems within our family. So anyway, I was, seeing a lot of people in my office who are coming from difficult childhood backgrounds. And sometimes they come in and are sort of confused about, why is this still so difficult for me? I've moved out. It's been many years. I've married. I've had children. Like, a lot has happened. And there's maybe two things here that are worth mentioning is, like I said, the first one is it doesn't just disappear, the effects of what has happened to us in our childhood. The other thing is, for a lot of people, they were still having really difficult, troubled, tumultuous relationships with one or both of their parents. So again, just that it didn't stop, but it has really continued. And so despite the fact that they are a full-grown adult, often, like I said, with their own families and living separately, their parents were really wreaking havoc in their lives with the behavior that they were continuing to do that wasn't really dissimilar to what they were doing when they were a child. So it's like it has just continued into adulthood. And a lot of people are at that breaking point of, I want to have a relationship with my parents. I care about them. I love them, but it is causing me so much distress that it is, I'm at a crossroads. Should I continue? How do I continue? What kind of boundaries do I need? Is it ever going to change? So many of those questions. And like I said, just a real emotional load that people are feeling around that. And I would say that can be anything from sadness to anger, a lot of guilt and shame that is a part of that as well. So it's a lot for people to bear. And anyway, just working with my clients in seeing how difficult it is for them to make the decision about whether to continue a relationship with their parents or not, being just so difficult to make, so emotionally laden for them. And I would say seeing a lot of people just struggle on in the relationship, despite knowing it's really dysfunctional and it's really bad for them, but not feeling like they can actually get out from underneath it, or that that's an okay thing to do, really led me to writing the book.
It's a heavy topic. Were there fears coming up for you as you wrote this book? Because it is kind of a controversial topic.
I wouldn't say fears. I think one of the things that I have going for me is I've developed a pretty thick skin around it. I wouldn't say it doesn't affect me at all when somebody makes negative comments online or sends me an email that's really nasty, because it does happen. People are saying, why are you encouraging people to cut off their parents? This is a terrible thing to do. You're supposed to be helping people have relationships with their family. But I think if you really understand the message, and I'll say the other thing is, I would say probably 10 out of 10 times, those are people who didn't actually read the books. It's a lot of assumptions about it. And I think it's really their fears, not really what I'm trying to tell people is that, because if we get down to it and we say people who are truly being abused in one form or another, nobody wants to advocate for people to stay in abusive relationships. I think it's just, there's a difference of opinion of what constitutes an abusive relationship. And I think one thing that happens is people who are in abusive relationships, either probably maybe the abuser or the victim, tend to minimize what's going on. They minimize the harm. There's a lot of denial around that. There's also a lot of normalizing when it's the way your family has operated for as long as you can remember. It, on a certain level, it feels like this is how families operate, right? This is normal behavior for parents to make these demands or call me names or criticize me and put me down or interfere or violate my boundaries or whatever it is. And so certainly I have ideas about what I think constitutes an abusive relationship, but I don't think I should be the arbitrator on what is abuse and what isn't. I think is in the situation, you get to decide. what feels like abuse to you and where that line is for you. It really shouldn't be anybody else's call to say, well, you should put up with X, Y, and Z, because I don't think that's so bad.
It's interesting because we give people permission and encouragement to get out of abusive romantic relationships, but with parental relationships, there's this, oh, how could you do that? How could you cut off your parents? How could you, this whole stigma and shame and guilt towards the person that needs to set that boundary for themselves. How do you help people work through that?
Well, I think, like I was saying, that we want to start with really trying to be honest about what's going on in the relationship and move out of any form of denial or minimizing, and understanding what is a healthy relationship, what it would look like specifically to have a healthy parent-adult-child relationship, and how that might be different than what's going on. And I think also really just helping people feel better about themselves and understand that they have value and they have worth and that they deserve to be treated well is a really important piece of it. The challenge, of course, is that one of the things I say often is that when you're in an abusive relationship, it's really hard to do that healing work that also would help you get out of the abusive relationship, right? So we talk about things like increasing self-esteem and learning how to treat yourself with compassion and set boundaries and things like that. But those things are really hard when you are in a relationship where you're constantly being pummeled emotionally, or possibly physically, but certainly emotionally and verbally, and put down all of the time. And those messages have been so ingrained, again, from such an early age, that you really believe a lot of the negative things that your parents or your family has been telling you. So it's tricky, but not impossible, certainly. And I think that's why sometimes there's a sense that people are going to therapy and then the therapy is then causing them to cut ties with their family, when it's not exactly the therapy or the therapist, it's the healing process, right, of learning to recognize what is abuse and what kind of relationships you want. And again, building self-esteem and learning that you have a right to set boundaries. And sometimes that boundary is that real clear one. I can't actually have a relationship with some people because of the way that they treat me, and that's an ongoing pattern.
So with some people, let's kind of get down to, if someone says, well, it's more like a mind game. So some people have a real hard time articulating, well, they're not, it's like a mind game. They make me feel bad and guilty. And it's a constant, well, I guess if you want to do that, I'll be over here. And that kind of, it's hard to name it exactly. How do you help people start naming what I would call the mind game?
Yeah, and I call that manipulation and mind games. Exactly. And again, it's tough because I think labeling it helps and giving examples helps, because we can say things like, how are they manipulating you, or how are they playing mind games? And it's like, if you don't really know what that is and what's, again, sort of where the line is between what's typical or healthy in a relationship, it's really hard to spot it. So there is, I think, an educational piece of, when you hear some of that, is to call it out and say, that sounds like it's a manipulation. In healthy relationships, we can communicate directly about what it is that we want or how we feel about something. We're not using these underhanded tactics to try to coerce people to do things that they don't want to do, right? That's not respectful, and that's not a kind way to treat people.
Yeah, because I think they believe it's them. Well, it must, because they're being told it's you, it's you, it's you. You're upsetting me. You're not calling me back. You're never text me back. You're, whatever.
Yes,
so the person
right.
is laden with feeling like it's me.
Yeah, it's a great point. Right, because some of that is very overt with, you're selfish, you're a bad son or daughter. So there is that sense that it gets turned around on you. And if only you could be better, whatever that means to your parents, then I wouldn't have to treat you this way. Which again, it's a classic abusive technique, right? And again, if we think about abusive romantic relationships, we know that that's right at the top of the playbook that people use to try to get the victim to feel like they are responsible for the abuse that they are suffering. So again, I think if we can really look at some of those parallels, it's really quite similar. And we know quite a bit about the way that romantic abuse happens in romantic relationships, used to convince people that they are the ones who are wrong, they're the problem, and if they are to leave, they're going to be worse off, they're going to be isolated, they're going to have no support, nobody's going to love them. All these terrible things are going to happen to them if they try to get out of their relationship. So there is a lot of elements of control that are happening. And sometimes it's really subtle. And that's, again, why it can be hard to see what's going on for people.
Let's talk about when somebody is deciding, because the workbook is great on walking you through questions to help you do some self-reflection on patterns and what's going on deeper inside. How does someone begin to face this decision, like whether to cut a parent or parents off?
Right. So it's very much a process for people. And again, contrary to what some people think, is it's not something that is a spur of a moment decision. It's not something that happens because of one difficult interaction. I'll tell you, this is always, in my experience, years in the making. It is literally the results of years of dysfunction that have brought somebody to that point. And again, what that point is going to be different for everybody. So I also like to remind people, if you're wrestling with the decision, it's uncomfortable, but that's okay. Our goal is not necessarily to rush to a decision. You can take the time that you need. And for a lot of people, that takes a really long time, and that's understandable. It is a really big decision and not one that people should make lightly, but it does require a lot of self-reflection. And by that, I really just mean that you do take time to think about the past, the history of this relationship and what that has looked like, what is going on right now in the present. And using that, you can make a good estimation of what's going to happen in the future. Are there any signs of change? Are there any signs of improvement? Because obviously, if you still feel like, oh, something might change, it's going to be really hard to end something. But it is a process, and it doesn't have to be something that is all or nothing either. Again, I want to give people permission to have whatever kind of contact works for them. So for some people, that is absolutely no contact ever. And they find that that's the only solution that works for them. That's what allows them to do the healing that they need to do. And that's what allows them to move forward and sort of have peace in their life. And other people can figure out ways to have some very firm, specific boundaries and have a limited amount of contact with their family. So maybe that's only through email, or it's only, I see them once a year on this particular holiday, or whatever that is. I mean, there's various forms. And again, there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's very much about figuring out what works for you. And that is going to change. Again, there are going to be some people who figure out what works for them, and that's it, and they stick with it, and there's no shifts. But I would say for probably the majority of people, they change as people, their life circumstances change, their families shift as well. I mean, there are divorces, there are deaths, there are new members of families, and so all of that can change the dynamics as well. And so it's really hard to know 10 years from now if you're going to want the same boundaries that you want or need right now as well. So really, we just need to make a decision about what is going to work for us right now. What do I need now? I mean, I would say try not to get too far ahead of yourself into the future about saying, okay, well, what is this going to be like down the road? Let's just deal with what do I need now and how can I get that for myself? Because the other thing is, for some people, once that separation really allows, I would say, space, time, energy for healing. And we can probably come back and talk some more about that. But once you have sort of worked through some of the trauma and the grief and the difficulties that have gotten you to this point, you're also going to be able to have a different sense, perhaps, about what you need going forward.
I think the deepest work that I see when people are deciding whether they should cut ties with their parents or not is the grief work of what they hope they would have, what they have. And sometimes there's been traumas where something might have happened to one of their children based on a parent that sparks them to need to make a choice for safety reasons. And there's so much grief and loss, guttural. I would say guttural grief and loss, just deep depths of it that I think people sometimes don't want to face, or it gets too overwhelming. So let's talk about that guttural grief that comes with this.
Yeah. And I think it's confusing for a lot of people to have this intense grief. And at the same time, there may be a sense of relief, right? So you've got these two really polar experiences going on. Like, I'm relieved to sort of have this freedom from this oppressive relationship. And yet, why am I so sad? And grief is not always sadness, is another thing that we want to remember. That's kind of the most obvious. I'm crying, I'm exhausted, I just overwhelmed. But sometimes grief is sort of numbness, and it's anger, and it's confusion. And I think no matter what it is that we're grieving is always difficult, and it is something that we often shy away from. Let's just stick that over there. I don't want to have to deal with it. And I think grieving a relationship with your family when they're still alive is extra complicated, because most people do not understand why you are grieving when you're the one who decided to not have the relationship. Like, it doesn't make sense to the outside world for the most part. So people don't get a lot of support. They don't get a lot of understanding around that. It, again, can be a big source of guilt and shame, which gets in the way of people reaching out for support as well. But absolutely, I mean, it can just, I think, decimate people. And again, especially at certain times of the years, holidays, birthdays, anniversaries can really be difficult, and it can really trigger the grief around not being with family on holidays and events that are so family focused in our society. Is really tough to be in that situation. And you're right. I mean, some of the grief is about what has literally been lost, but I think a big part of it is grieving what you never got, what you have always wanted, what you have been holding out hope to be able to have with your family. And when you are cutting ties with them, it is an acknowledgement that that is not happening. It is not likely to happen. So there is sort of that resignation of, okay, I have to give up the dream, whether that's a conscious thought or unconscious. It's there. And everybody wants to have a loving, close family connection. And so that's really huge to realize that it is not going to happen. Well, it's not going to happen with this group of family. I would say, we want to remember that we can create other family groups or family-like groups that can give us that kind of good emotional stuff. But there is something just so strong about the connection between parent and child. And the need to have your parents' love and approval is so immensely strong that, again, I mean, it both speaks to the level of grief that comes with that, and just how difficult it is for people to come to the decision, and how much they have endured before they get to the point of deciding that they can't have contact with a parent.
And I find that sometimes people will go, well, it wasn't all bad. And there were some, maybe not for everybody, but for some windows of time where it was connective and they had moments of connection, and they long for those. And so then they'll second guess. Maybe it is me because it's not all bad. That was all bad. I mean, that terrible, terrible people. And so then there's this waffling that can happen. Talk about self-doubt and that waffling, because sometimes we can have these windows of moments where things are good, or we have felt some connection, and then we second guess cutting off ties. So let's talk a little bit about that self-doubt.
That's a great point because that is often the case is that relationships aren't necessarily all good or all bad, which again just adds to that confusion about is this bad enough for me to leave this relationship? And is there hope? Because we do sometimes have good interactions or good times, or I have good memories of past times with my family. And so that's completely normal, I would say. For one thing, is recognize that's still part of the process. It's still part of your assessment. It's still part of your reflection on what is going on in this relationship. And I would say sometimes those good times are genuinely good times. They are true positive interactions. And other times they're really part of the manipulation that is part of an abusive cycle. And again, as I know, just sort of add more to the confusion of saying, well, how do I figure out? How do I make that distinction? But again, like we know from romantic relationships that often what happens is there is a terrible abusive interaction, and then the abuser will do something intentionally, apologize, the classic bringing flowers, gifts, something to try to show that they are sorry. There's promises, I'm going to change. So there's that sort of makeup honeymoon kind of phase that's part of an abusive cycle. And then that lasts for a couple of days, a couple of weeks, maybe even a couple of months, and then something else happens. So again, we want to remember that it's important to look at the pattern. We want to be able to look at things over time. We're not just saying what has happened this week. There should be a pattern of things that are happening in this relationship. So again, I'm not saying you have one terrible thing that happens that may or may not be cause for cutting somebody off. I mean, I think there probably are situations where something so egregious could happen that you say, I really need to step out of this relationship. But I would say the vast majority of times, that big egregious thing has followed a pattern of perhaps less egregious forms of abuse. And so sometimes it's like, oh, here's the straw that broke the camel's back, but it certainly wasn't really an isolated incident that was going on. So we want to look at things and consider what has been happening over a course of time, certainly. But again, it's hard when you have been essentially trained to second guess yourself and to not trust your instincts. And this is where it can sometimes be helpful to get some outside perspective. And I don't want to say this should replace your own instincts and you being able to trust your own judgment. But certainly when we're making any kind of big decision, it's completely normal to ask some of our trusted, close friends, a therapist, a mentor, somebody else in your life that you think has good judgment and can really take a look at things from an outside perspective, perhaps, and give you some ideas. Not that they should be saying you must do this, but at least give you a little bit of guidance on it, I think can be helpful. And then we can either use that or store it away for another day and just take that for additional information to use.
And the support is so helpful. I think the other question I get from clients is, let's say you have one parent that you're really struggling with, okay, but the other parent's going to stay with that parent. They're going to stay married or they're going to stay together. And this one feels like, well, they feel a little healthier, but they're staying with the dysfunctional one, which we know creates the dysfunctional system, even though they're staying, but they're struggling with cutting off the one that seems a little bit healthier, even though they're staying with the partner that's not healthy. What do you say to that?
Such a good question, Kristen. You're right. I mean, this is often the case is there's usually one parent who is kind of say the real abuser, the real person who is causing the problems, and the other person who maybe doesn't do anything about it or goes along or enables that behavior. So, I mean, they're sort of problematic in a different way, but less directly hurtful to the adult child. And again, it ends up being pretty individual. I have certainly seen situations where the adult child has been able to continue a relationship of some sort with one parent. There are also a lot of situations where that is impossible. And again, for various reasons, either because it's just too hard to maintain the boundaries that are needed. And sometimes there are situations where the abusive parent just says no. It sort of basically disallows the other parent from having any contact with the adult child as well. And so it's not uncommon for somebody to lose a relationship with both parents and sometimes even with siblings or other extended family members, because often what happens is when you start putting up those really firm boundaries or taking steps to have no contact, there's a backlash. There is what some people will call the smear campaign, where there's a lot of negative, false information that is disseminated about the adult child. People are forced to essentially take sides because the abusive parent holds a lot of power typically within the family system. And so they will use that power to, again, force people to say, you're either on my side or you're not. And if you're not, you're out too. So it can force other family members who really wanted to stay neutral to decide, are they going to be a part of the family or are they also going to be on the outside? And so it's a really a tough dynamic within families. So, I mean, I don't know what to say other than that. Sometimes that is the sad reality, is that if you really want to cut out one parent, you unfortunately may lose other relationships within the family. And again, I would say, I mean, sometimes that can shift over time, not always. So it is an unfortunate reality. And again, going back to the grief, I mean, this is often part of sort of that extended grief work, is it can be more than just one relationship or just a relationship with your parents that gets lost in all of this.
There's two things that are coming up for me that I feel like can be patterns. One is when the parent of the one that's married to the abusive partner, let's say, or has the issue. Okay. Maybe it's an addiction issue. Maybe it's other issues. Okay. They deny that the parent has a problem. They're like, well, it's not that bad. The minimization you were talking about. Well, they don't believe what maybe the adult child's saying. That can be indicators to say, ooh, maybe the other parent isn't very healthy either. So there's some subtleties that need to be addressed, I feel like, in this dynamic. If we're looking at whether to cut ties with the other parent, and then how does that make you feel when they deny or minimize how you feel about the other parent?
Yeah. Right. I mean, I think if we really get into it, they're not innocent in all of this.
Exactly.
Either, right.
Exactly.
I mean,
they play a role.
Right. They may not be the one who is calling you the horrible names and doing whatever it is that the other parent is doing, but certainly harm is caused. I mean, even by standing on the sidelines doing nothing causes harm. And that's probably sort of best case scenario. Absolutely. I mean, they're playing a part in you being mistreated by allowing that and allowing you to feel, gaslighted in that situation, to feel like you deserve that kind of treatment, telling you that you should put up with it is causing harm.
Yes. And I think that's hard for people to rumble because they want to hold on to one relationship. It's like, well, at least I have mom or dad or sibling. And when I've had other cases where the sibling's like, you need to forgive. Why can't you forgive? That's what we're taught to do. You need to forgive. And man, that plays havoc on the person. Then it's like, well, maybe I do need to forgive. Maybe it is me not forgiving my parent. What do you say to that? Because that can really be hard for, I've had several cases where that's been the case, where someone said, you need to work on forgiveness.
Forgiveness is a big one. And again, it's something that people often have very strong feelings about. And we get told a lot that forgiveness is the virtuous thing to do. We should forgive people. We should give people a second chance, although those forgiveness and second chances are not the same, but we often lump them together, I think. And gosh,
it's a tough one.
I think if forgiveness is a helpful concept for people and it's something that feels like it's part of the healing process for them to forgive their parents, that's great. And I think it can be, but it absolutely does not have to be. I encounter a lot of people who feel that this idea of that they have to forgive is very tasteful. And it really is, to me, what I would say, sort of adds insult to injury to say, well, now you need to forgive the people. It feels like I'm asking
dismissive.
To let them off the hook, to say it was okay on some level. And obviously it's not. And again, it feels like it's a way to minimize what has happened and say, let's just brush it under the rug and move forward. Forgive and forget, that old saying really comes to mind as well. So, in my opinion, forgiveness is not necessarily needed. I think people can find a path forward that does not involve forgiveness. Using that concept, I think moving forward does ultimately, you need to find a way to move beyond being so angry. But certainly, I mean, anger has its place, especially in the beginning of this process. Anger is there to tell us that something is wrong. And that's important. We need to listen to it. So our goal is to not ever feel angry. But again, as we do our healing and want to move forward with our life, we don't want to hold on to immense anger because that can get in the way of us having other healthy relationships, being able to do the things that we want to be able to do in life, feeling in control of our emotions and so forth. So anyway, if forgiveness is not your cup of tea, then don't worry about it. It's not something that you have to do. It can be that source of shame though. But I think if you can try to reframe it for yourself and say, okay, that's a concept. It's one approach. It doesn't have to be the only approach. And it's generally not helpful for people to be telling other people what they should be doing or what that healing path is supposed to look like for them, or even what they think is the moral path for people to be taking. You know, this is one of the things that's great about being an adult is you can make your own decisions about all of that. And I know that's hard when you are, again, coming from a family where you have been really constrained and told what's right and what's wrong and what you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing. And this is, again, very much a part of that healing process is sort of coming into your own self and recognizing that you can make all of these decisions for yourself and they can be different than what other people think is right or what you should be doing. And that's okay.
That's a true differentiated self to say, it's okay for me to have my own thoughts, feelings, and opinions that are different than you. And I'm still valuable and lovable and enough, regardless if you don't agree.
And to recognize that there are people that you can have relationships with people who respect that and value that even in you. And that can be a really different experience because if you've only had relationships with family members who do not allow any of this, right? You're sort of in this state of fear all of the time that I have to keep myself really small. I have to conform to what my family wants me to do all of the time. Feels like that's the only way to have relationships, but there are a whole other set of healthy relationships out there where people want you to be your own unique, authentic self and to live fully as yourself, whatever that means. And that is right. That's so good. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing when it happens because it's such a painful way to live your life when you're constantly having to hold back parts of your identity or explore who you are to try to please other people. There's, this immense freedom in being able to just be yourself, to relax, to find out who that is. And, I think that's true of yourself as an individual, but also other relationships that can be possible for you as your authentic self too.
I love that because that is so key. I think the other thing I wanted to touch on is when the parent says, well, help me understand what I did. I don't know what I did. And you tell them, I've had many clients, they've been very clear. We have a centered message and they go, well, I still don't understand. I don't understand. What did I do? What did I do? And they keep going back to this. What did I do? What do you say to those folks that are...
Good one. You have such good questions. These are such common things, and that is such a common dynamic. It's like they're trying to make you justify, prove to me that I've been terrible.
Because I don't get what I've done. I don't understand. Right. I don't know what I've done. And that you've told them and they keep saying the same thing.
I would say most of the time, yes, it makes sense to make a reasonable effort to convey what the issues are. If you have done this several times or in several different forms, and I don't mean like several times in the past week, I mean over the years, you've made a couple of attempts to explain to state, here's what the issues are. Here's what the problem is in this relationship. Here's what I need. And here's what I need to have to be changed. What's the point in doing it for, the 25th time, right? You have to ask yourself, like, what's a reasonable amount of explaining? And again, you might think about this, sort of step out of this particular relationship and imagine this was a relationship, an issue with your spouse. I mean, how many times does it make sense, or your child, or how many times are you going to explain the exact same thing before you decide that they're not going to understand it? They're choosing not to understand it. They're not capable of understanding it. Or again, that this is a tactic to keep you spinning your wheels in this relationship, trying for them to have the upper hand, and you in this place of, okay, I got to prove something to them. Right. So those are some of the questions you can just ask yourself. Is it helpful to keep explaining? And at a certain point, again, I can't tell you exactly what the magic number is. 25 is not really a magic number. That's just an example. For some people, I might say it's 3 times, and that's fine. Whatever it is for you that feels like you can walk away saying, okay, I know I made a reasonable effort to explain it. And if they have not understood at this point, then that's their issue. It's no longer my issue. And I choose to let that piece go and say, I've done my part here. I'm clear on what the issues are. I've made my effort to tell them, and I can't control how they take that information in or not take that information in.
So let's say you're ready to cut off with your parents, and you're ready to cut ties. You're saying this is not healthy for my mental, physical, and emotional well-being. And how does someone go about doing that? People like to kind of know, what do I do now if I want to go through with this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wish there was like, here's the 1, 2, 3. But again, it's very much an individual situation, because some of it is going to depend on how much contact and what kind of contact have you been having up to this point. If you live down the street from your parents and you've been seeing them every day, cutting them off is going to look different than it does for the person who lives across the country and talks to them on the phone once a month or something like that. So we have to consider where it is that we're starting from. But I would say, I mean, before you do anything, do some work yourself and really come up with your plan. What is this going to look like? And write it down. How are you going to do the things that you need to do? How are you going to respond when X happens? When they text you, when they call you, when they come over to your house? Have a plan on how are you going to handle those situations? What boundaries do you need to put into place? And I would say, if you really are serious about either no contact or very limited contact with very firm boundaries, is use all of the tools that you have in your toolbox. I mean, I would say I see so many people who say, I'm not going to have any contact with them, but then they are unwilling to do something like block their phone number or block their email. And so they're flooded with all of this incoming pressure, boundary violations. And I'm not going to say it's painless by any means if you were to block the number. I mean, that can create a different kind of anxiety and stress, but you're at least no longer getting the 25 messages that are coming at you all day long. And that's making it really difficult to maintain the boundary. So anyway, figure out what are some of the things that will help you do this.
Have a plan.
Yeah. I mean, you can reasonably estimate what your parents are likely to do. I think most adult children are actually really, really good at this, because this is long standard patterns that we're talking about. So you think about, okay, if I don't respond to my mom's text, what's she going to do? You can probably figure out what the likely scenarios are and come up with a game plan and figure out, okay, how am I going to deal with that?
Do you recommend them telling them, I am no longer going to engage in communication with you, so I'm not going to text anymore, I'm not going to email? Do you recommend explicitly, clearly and directly telling them, or does that depend on the situation?
Yeah, I'm sorry to say.
As a therapist, that's why I always explain things. I'm like, I
know. Everybody wants, like, what's the answer? Yeah. I think if telling them feels like it is going to cause bigger problems, it is going to put you in danger, it is going to set them off and enrage them to possibly do things that feel like they can be dangerous for you, then don't do anything like that. Safety needs to be number one priority for everybody all of the time in everything that they're doing. And again, there's various ways. If you decide you want to say something, there are various ways that you can do that. It does not have to be, I never want to talk to you again, get lost. There are certainly, sort of softer approaches. But again, that really depends on your situation. Sometimes a softer approach is not a good one because it just invites people to keep knocking on your door figuratively, right? And you really need to say, I don't want to hear from you. Please stop contacting me. But other times people, again, depending on where you are and how certain you are of what it is that you want at this point, you could say something like, I need to take some space. I will be in touch with you when I'm ready to talk to you. That's sort of leaving the door open, but it's on your terms versus putting it on them, asking them to contact you again. So it's something that we just, I think, keep reevaluating as we're moving through the process, realizing you may at some point want to say something, you may not, figuring out if that's useful in maintaining the boundaries. Does it feel useful to you to make that statement? I would say with all of it, though, you want to give yourself the time to really think through what it is you want to say and how you want to say it rather than doing something reactive, which I think often doesn't work out so well. Is that, again, like if your mom's texting, and then you just get so fed up with it and you just fire off that text like, don't ever contact me again, I'm blocking you. That may not have been the response that you wanted. And that could probably be avoided if we just say, okay, let me take 24 hours. Let me think this through. Let me figure out what I want to say, how best to do that, and then do it.
Last thing I want to say is if someone decides to move forward with cutting ties and a sibling comes along or somebody else says, what if they die? They're getting old. What if they die? How are you going to feel? Because this happens so often that people tell people this. How are you going to feel if they die? And you just cut them off. What do you say to that?
Oh, it's such a tough one. It's super common, as you're saying, that people say that. It's very much used as a guilt trip, a manipulation to try to get you to continue the relationship. But of course, I mean, there is a certain reality that your parents may be older or not in good health. So, yeah, we want to recognize that this is a possibility, certainly. But you can also think about how does that change the decision? The fact that your parents most likely will die before you is the reality. Are there things that you want to say to them? Is there anything left to be said? And what purpose is that going to serve? One thing we want to remember is your parents are still going to most likely be the same people they are today. Sometimes people have a fantasy about the end of life and that people are going to be different. The deathbed reconciliation, apology, that somehow I'm going to get all of the answers and somebody saying something that you've been waiting to hear all these years. And it doesn't tend to happen. So we want to remember that and be realistic about what the relationship has been. And, I think ultimately you have to ask yourself, I mean, the possibility of your parents dying, is that a reason to continue to be in a bad relationship with them for however many more years that might be? I think when a loved one dies, a family member dies, it's very common to have regrets. And I see this even in the best of relationships. When you have a relationship with somebody that was very functional and very loving, and that person dies, people still have regrets. The things they didn't say, the things they didn't do. I also don't think we can avoid having regrets when people die. That seems to be just a natural part of the human experience, especially around death, is to look at that situation and say, I wish I had said I love you more. I wish I had apologized for this. I wish I hadn't left in a haste, whatever it is. Sometimes they're bigger regrets than that, of course, but maybe there's something helpful in also just recognizing that that is a normal part of the process, is to wish that things had been different, but that doesn't mean that we can make things different. And especially with a relationship like the ones that we're talking about. If you have really looked at the relationship and concluded that this relationship is not likely to ever become a healthy relationship, then that is the reality of it.
That's right. I think that's a huge, important point. This has been so helpful. I literally could keep talking about this because we don't talk about it very much. That's why I'm like, oh, and this and that. Is there anything we didn't cover that you feel like are important points as we wrap up? Is there anything you can think of?
Oh, probably. You open the door, I'll start talking more, Kristen. But I just like to say for people who are wrestling with either the decision or have made it but feel guilt, sadness or anger or shame or any of those difficult emotions around it, is I think it's really important to just remember that it is a really difficult decision. It is a really painful situation to be in. And although it can feel very lonely, this is actually not an uncommon situation. I think, as you have nicely pointed out, it's not something that people talk about very much, which can make it feel like it's both wrong and it's unusual. And I don't think either of those are the case. So definitely, I mean, I want to encourage people to try to look for some support. And again, I say that knowing that it can be tough because there's not a lot of organized support. But of course, the solution to that is people coming together and creating support. And it takes a lot of vulnerability to reach out to people and to say, this is what I'm going through, and to see who understands. Not everybody will, but there are people who do understand and who have certainly had really difficult family and childhood experiences. It's tough, but there is a path forward. And I think the other thing that I just like to reiterate is that one of the reasons that I really feel like it's okay for people to cut ties with their parents in certain situations is because when you're in the abusive relationship, it's really difficult to do the emotional healing, the trauma healing that is so important. And really doing that work is really going to be able to help you move forward in, I think, really all areas of your life ultimately. And so again, whether the space that you're taking is temporary or it's permanent, it will give you the ability to really get in touch with yourself and say, okay, let me do the work that I need to do for myself and really prioritize myself. And then once that has happened, and it's not like that's a finite thing. I mean, it's really sort of an ongoing process, of course. But once you've done a good chunk of that and you're feeling better about yourself, you're feeling healed to some extent, you're feeling less reactive, you're feeling in control and less of those difficult emotions, then you are going to be able to, I think, see the situation in a whole new light. And again, that may or may not mean any relationship with your family or not, but it is going to just, I think, open the doors to a lot of new things for you, new positive relationships and connections and opportunities and experiences for you.
More freedom on the other side. I want to say, get the Better Boundaries workbook. I feel like this is a prerequisite for the new books. You get them, get both is my recommendation. Get the Better Boundaries workbook and get the Cutting Ties. I think they go together. I feel like they're so good because they complement each other so well. I mean, we're talking about boundaries really in the Cutting Ties. I think both of them are introspective because you're doing, it's a workbook and a journal. So you're doing the insightful work. Right. And that's what I think is the differentiator with your books is you're looking within. And that's how you start getting clarity. That's how you start getting the courage and to make these decisions, to set the boundaries, to move forward and break the pattern. So that would be my suggestion.
That might take two. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Right.
Where can they find them? If they're like, yes, I would like both. And you can listen to the boundaries episode that we did together before. So where can they get the books?
Basically, any place that sells books. There's so few actual bookstores these days anymore. But if you have a local bookstore, go there, ask them to get it for you. If they don't have it in stock, all the usuals, Amazon and Barnes and Noble and any place online that sells books will have them.
And follow Dr. Sharon Martin on social. She's got so much good content on codependency, perfectionism, boundaries, cutting ties with your parent. I mean, all of this dysfunctional family systems. You have got such a wealth of information. So follow Dr. Sharon Martin on social. I repost a lot of her stuff on both Pathways to Healing Counseling and personally. So just follow along. She's so helpful in really diving into family systems and codependency and cutting ties if necessary with your parents. So thank you so much, Sharon, for being here. I'm so grateful for you.
Thanks so much, Kristen. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to the Close the Chapter podcast. My hope is that you took home some actionable steps along with motivation, inspiration, and hope for making sustainable change in your life. If you enjoyed this episode, click the subscribe button to be sure to get the updated episodes every week and share with a friend or a family member. For more information about how to get connected, visit Kristen, Kristen, Boyce, Boice.com. Thanks and have a great day.